The magic button. Officially, good afternoon, happy new year, happy spring. My name is Brian Jara. Within OIE, I oversee the team, and there's actually a new acronym, new-ish acronym. So the first slide, officially, you just saw if you were in the main session, my boss, Dr. Patricia Bradley, the VP for OIE. OIE includes four different teams. You heard Chris mention DEI education, you heard Dr. Bradley mention DEI educators. So in late fall, we kind of reorganized sort of our branding. So these two departments are the ones that show up the most in today's session. I oversee what we're now framing as IEES. It was shorthanded as DEI education over the years. It includes a team of four. We are the folks who offer education training for the entire campus. We're the folks that also support, as Dr. Bradley alluded to, bias response and support. When it comes to bias response, we work closely with the equity compliance team. So I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive to what VP Bradley talked about, plus a few other skill sets. This is a shameless plug for acronyms and resources. So all of these four departments, ADS and CSD, which are both in the union, IEES, we're over in admin along with equity compliance, along with the VP's office. So all of OIE works across campus every day with faculty and staff and students and alumni. So to sort of set up our plan, the next two slides address a couple of things. First, I appreciate Dr. Bradley mentioning current events. So if you were around on campus or wherever you were in the fall, there were probably ways in which current events came up, sometimes leading to heated, passionate discussions, debates. So we're going to talk a little bit more about ideas like free expression. The first disclaimer I want to throw out there for us is there's a difference between freedom of expression and freedom from consequences of that expression. I think if you were on campus, you may have witnessed a number of organized and spontaneous exhibitions, demonstrations, protests, and more. So I do want to give you some bullet points around how do we, especially when you're leading your orgs, get more comfortable with what it actually means when we talk about First Amendment, free expression, and similar topics. Next up, while we all in the US have the freedom to say whatever we may choose to, and there are some limitations. Let's remember there often are consequences, especially in a community such as TU. That might mean disagreement, that might mean tension, that might mean fighting, arguing. It might mean being misinterpreted. So that we're going to hold those two things together. Ultimately, as you've already heard mentioned, TU is part of the USM and part of the state of Maryland. So it is important that we do two things. We support free expression through the Constitution, and we make sure that you all know and help us spread the word that there are resources when it comes to experiences and incidents that involve harm, what feels like bias, what feels like discrimination. So we're going to try to always know that TU tries to juggle both at the same time. And I think as we've all seen over the past few years, these incidents that may lead to tensions and feel like bias, discrimination, or worse can also happen in person as well as in virtual spaces. And along those lines, what we've noticed is when things get tense, we offer this idea of a distinction between feeling comfortable, different from feeling safe. So that's sort of the setup for the session. I really want to stress that we're going to try to prioritize a brief nod to some policies that are relevant, a quick review for some definitions. I'd love to focus more on a planned break in the slides that we can actually compare notes. We're always going to make sure we take time to lead with the important resources. And shameless plug, the last slide of this deck is a QR code to get these slides. So you do not need to feel like you need to take notes. The very last slide, I'll let you all aim your cameras and you'll be able to get to the Google slide deck version of all of these slides. So that's the plan. I welcome conversations in the chat. I welcome the Zoom hands to come off mic. I would rather we have more voices than just mine for our time. And I've got two screens. You might see my head shift this way. I can always see the chat. I can see the list of participants. And with that said, we're gonna just launch into it. Okay, you are welcome to keep your cameras off. There's one planned break from slides. I would love to see faces if you are comfortable. And then I've got an interactive activity that might be helpful to see each other. But the only the university policy I will reference today briefly is the one guiding the university's response to discrimination. I share this because that policy lists definitions of key terms like discrimination and alternative mediation and protected classes. The bottom part of this slide lists what are currently for Towson University in the state of Maryland, what is the official list of protected classes. I want to stress that this list is a combination of federal law, state law, and university policy. I'm coming up on 8 years at TU. This list has evolved over the years. You may have friends at schools in other states. Their list may look different. For example, the most recent revisions to this list of protected classes in the state of Maryland, the last three, gender identity, gender expression, and homelessness status, were not always protected classes at TU in the state of Maryland. So that's an important caveat when you're thinking about what's happening at TU compared to private institutions and other institutions around the country. Freedom of expression. As Dr. Bradley alluded to, the fall semester saw a number of ways that national and international current events kind of crash landed on our campus. The ways in which our campus continues to struggle with a variety of international and national current events. And along those lines, free expression often leads to miscommunication, misinterpretation, feelings, tensions, and I'm interested to see the ways in which you might reflect for those that were here in the fall, the ways in which your orgs have either made space for those discussions or avoided those discussions. But ultimately, remember that as a public institution, free expression, think of it as not one static lane. It is a variety of things that include beliefs, thoughts, ideas, and emotions. And that's sometimes I think there's a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of what the First Amendment does and does not do for us. Now, a couple of distinctions on other related key terms, and these were alluded to by VP Bradley in the top 10 section. First, hate speech as a term, it's not a separate exact statute that you can be found responsible for. So one of us in this Zoom meeting could not be found to have hate speech another one of us. That's because the term hate speech itself refers to a couple of things. First, know that, fortunately or not, most of the things that the reasonable person would count as hate speech, generally speaking, likely is protected. There's only narrow boundaries about types of speech that would be seen as not protected. And I'll give you a quick tool to try to make sense of how confusing and complicated this is. But ultimately, keep in mind that hate speech itself isn't even its own crime. In fact, hate crime requires an already known defined crime plus the element of the intent to intimidate based on actual or perceived membership in a protected class. Meaning, hate crime requires a defined crime such as assault, battery, theft, etc., along with, after an investigation, clear evidence that there was an attempt to engage in that crime because of one's actual or perceived identity or membership in a group that is protected. So this is complicated. I encourage you to, if you have any questions as they come up, throw them in the chat. I'll take occasional breaks to check to make sure that we're addressing anything that shows up in the chat. So how do we figure out which types of hate speech are protected? It's a narrower band, however, based on how federal and state definitions lead us to think about types of speech that have the specific intent to insult or target an individual or a group. So the things that fall outside that count as protected, even if most of us consider it to be hurtful, offensive, rude, disrespectful. Generally speaking, individual thoughts, beliefs, positions will fall into the protected category. This idea of a particular threat to individual or a specific group, we think about two different types. This idea of true threats refers to naming a particular individual by name or naming a particular protected class group by identity term, and the clear expression of intent to commit one or more crimes. So picture if you've ever lived on campus, the whiteboard. Picture the provocative statement. Picture the individual opinion, however rude or offensive. Like, all people who are left-handed don't belong here. It's an example of getting closer and closer to naming a particular individual or group. So true threat refers to that specific argument. Generally, a lot of the provocative statements that are shared on a public campus are individual views that aren't trying to target. So that's true threats. Fighting words refers to specific use of language, text, or images, again, to really incite, imply, or encourage one or more acts of violence or crimes, intentionally to intimidate. So this idea of fighting words, you may have heard in earlier schooling when you think about the First Amendment. What I remember always hearing growing up is you can say whatever you want, but you can't run into a movie theater and shout fire when there's not a fire. So that is an example of the incitement to one or more sort of acts of violence or crimes. So fighting words refers to, again, a specific intent to target or intimidate or create acts of violence or crimes against individual or group. So what does it all mean? Well, I'm going to mention for a minute, as you all may know or may be familiar with, we have a location on campus called Freedom Square, and we have at Freedom Square the chalkboards. So this idea of hate speech that's protected or not protected, generally speaking, because we have designated chalkboards for a particular space for free expression, generally most of what shows up on the chalkboards would fall under the category of protected speech. It always is a case-by-case basis. Now, I want to offer one more asterisk. I've mentioned before that we're in the state of Maryland. That is relevant because during COVID, the state of Maryland has for years tried to increase their coverage and response when it comes to hate crime. So during COVID, I think it was around 2021, it finally was passed in the Maryland state government. There's specific narrow bands that automatically elevate certain offenses to hate crimes. So the new-ish statute says there's this three-pronged definition that automatically would count as a hate crime in the state of Maryland. And the language starts, point one, the use of images including nooses or swastikas, that's point one. Point two, using them, putting them on individual property without the property owner's permission is point two. And then point three, intentionally to intimidate. So that three-pronged series of points in the state of Maryland now, if all three are found to be to reasonably exist, automatic hate crime. Now, it is still so new that we have not yet seen in the courts lots of testing of that statute. I share it just to say, if we go back to talking about to use chalkboards at Freedom Square, does that mean, the question goes, having a swastika or a noose on the chalkboard is a hate crime? On those chalkboards, generally the answer is probably not, because the point of those chalkboards is to support free expression. So that prong two about the property owner's permission, the purpose of the chalkboards is, generally speaking, giving permission to freely express. So it's more complicated than that, but I share that just to remind us that what's happening on this campus, the response might be very different than a private institution in Maryland or a public institution elsewhere in the country. So protected hate speech is a much more, unfortunately, a much more narrow band than what is protected. So that's hate speech. Bias incidents. Again, there is no separate definition at TU or in Maryland where you can be found to have caused a bias incident, therefore there's a punishment. It is at TU another opportunity for us to collect information, consider investigation, and then figure out what's needed. Is it education? Is it referring to possible violations of either student code of accountability or of employee contracts? So bias incidents is this vague umbrella catch-all for interactions. They could be verbal, written, physical, or all of the above. That consciously or unconsciously is targeting someone because of their identity, one or more of their identities or group memberships. Note that we've underlined consciously or unconsciously. I'm going to talk later on about this idea of intent and impact. That is useful in trying to make more sense of all of this. It's less important what your intent is when it comes to acts of bias or harm. It's more about the impact on one or more parties. So we stress that we're going to come back and say a little bit more about intent and impact. So to wrap up this intro, you have free speech as a catch-all. You have an also separate catch-all of possible hate crimes and or bias incidents. And it's important, especially, well, it's important for everyone here, just as TU students. It's also helpful for you all as leading one or more orgs to feel more and more comfortable about how to make sense of all of this. It is not your job as an org leader to serve as detective, police, judge. It is hopefully you're getting comfortable knowing what are the foundational ideas and how do you know who to refer to when you need more information. So with that, I'm going to enter an activity. I'm going to use some slides, but then I am going to take a pause for us to sort of share, hopefully come off camera and get more voices out here. So I'm going to do a check-in with your honest views. We're going to use a Likert scale. I'm going to share the scale. It involves 5 possible points. It's all about agreement. So on point number 1, it is the strongest possible disagreement. To point number 2, just disagree. Point number 3 is going to be neutral or uncertain. And then you've got all the way to 4 and 5, strength of agreement. I'm going to give you 1 or more statements. I'm going to ask for folks to use the chat to type the number of their current honest view of the statement. And then I'm going to take some breaks so we can actually have some conversations. There's no correct answer. All I need you to do is to give me your immediate, spontaneous, and honest view. Okay? So I'm going to make it tougher. I'm going to remove 3 as an option. I'm going to ask you to claim some level of agreement or disagreement with each statement. So, and we'll do a couple. I have a bunch planned. We won't get to all of them. I really want to use it as a way to kind of break the ice and get some more voices out here. Here comes the first one, and I'll share the scale with each one. My organization is skilled at handling strong differences of opinion when it comes to org matters. What is your immediate answer between 1, 2, 4, or 5? If you could use the chat, identify your individual honest current assessment. How much do you agree that your org currently is skilled at handling strong differences of opinion? I've got a couple of 4s showing up. Looks like we've got a strong pool of 4s. That's awesome. I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay. I'm going to do one more statement and then I'm going to take a break from the slides. So there's that idea of when it comes to org matters. The next statement is a little bit of a spinoff. My org is skilled at handling strong differences of opinion when it comes to talking about current events. So when it comes to talking about the world outside the org, how skilled currently is your org when it comes to strong differences of opinion in your org? Still seeing lots of fours. That's fascinating. So the first two have to do with your current assessment of your org when it comes to differences of opinion. I'm going to pause the slides. I'm going to ask for volunteers. Talk to me if you're willing. Can you give me an example about what's your support or evidence for a four, or what has happened? Why did you know not to say five or even two? So I'd welcome either in the chat or we're a small enough group if you're willing to come off mic. Give me some reasons or evidence for the numbers that you chose.
So for me, I'm Kiana. I would choose four for the both of them because we really haven't had any differences of opinions like that I've seen because we're kind of a small club. So we like all know each other. And it's really not the place to be discussing current events for us because we're a religious club. So it's like it doesn't really come up that often. So that's why I said four is that we really haven't had any.
Kiana, thank you. So I heard you say one of the big pieces is a relatively small org hopefully leads to comfort with getting to know each other and their styles, which makes total sense. Therefore, it gives you more chances to practice how to navigate those differences. Thank you so much. Anybody else willing to share?
I think for us, sometimes the leadership board knows each other well and can navigate conflict and differences. But our typical meetings are larger groups. And so personally, I don't think we feel that like opening something like that to a large group is appropriate. Like I think we anticipate that um, those types of conversations are more beneficial, constructive, and helpful in a smaller group setting. So there might be some like avoidance there. Like I don't want to have that conversation with 70 people at the same time. I'm not confident I could do it well.
Ah, so there's a really cool thread, organic thread here around the impact of org size. I also heard you really name an important piece of what is your role in the org. If you are part of the e-board, if you have a title, if you are a general member, and I offer as a takeaway tip, what are the ways that your individual role influence how you experience the org and how you experience disagreement. So I really appreciate this question around, is it appropriate for a certain size? And it's so important because picture the small org that has 12 active members, picture the org that has 80 active members. That's a huge factor in your choice to even open up to talk about disagreements. Thank y'all for whoever shared. I want to give you at least one or two more statements because I'm really curious to see where we go with this. So let me get back to the slides in the same scale. Okay, next up. Public demonstrations and protests on campus are valuable. Public demonstrations and protests on campus are valuable. Go ahead and put into the chat your individual view. We've got some twos. I'll give folks a few more seconds. And I was intentionally vague with this statement, and I'll explain why. Public demonstrations and protests on campus are valuable. We saw, I believe at last count, 2 or 3 dozen specifically in the fall related to international crises, the conflict in the Middle East. Okay, I'm going to offer a parallel statement and then we'll talk some more. The related statement is public demonstrations and protests on campus are disruptive to TU's mission. And it's not either or, by the way. So public demonstrations and protests are disruptive to TU's mission. Some disagreement. So some disagreements on both, which is I was curious to see where the answers would fall. I'm going to pause the slides and invite anyone to explain either their number or just their thoughts on this, particularly in your role in your org. And I'm really curious. I'm feeling nosy today. If you're willing to share, if you were on campus in the fall, I'm curious to get your sense of the ways in which current events either showed up or didn't show up, or impacted or didn't impact not just your org but you students. So I will just open it up for anyone who's willing to share. You're always welcome to put some words in the chat. You're always welcome to come off mic. It's up to you.
I think what first came to mind for me were some religious demonstrations that seemed very tense and like not helpful. But then when you started talking about current events in the world, I feel like demonstrations that bring awareness to issues and even getting to see peers caring deeply about things happening across the world, like I think those things are in line with Towson's mission to, help grow people up academically, certainly, but also as engaged citizens. So that's why I went with 2 as opposed to 1.
Thanks, Caitlin. I appreciate the collective group, the folks who were using the chat. A really interesting phenomena of this group feels both, but this idea of demonstrating the protest, disagreeing with the value and also disagreeing with, but they're not disruptive. And I was like, that's really interesting. And I appreciate all the views. And let me be real blatant. And you saw in the title and the blurb in the program, we're about to go there, meaning we are in already a heated US election season, which means state, local, and federal elections. And where I wanted to go next, in the last part of the session, is I'm really curious to know, what do we think we should be expecting or preparing for, both in your roles in your orgs and also as a campus. So I'm going to go back into the slides for the last statement that I had planned. And it is 2024 has lots of important state, local, state, and national elections. Every org should encourage discussing how elections impact our campus and our org's mission. So really, it's the belief of every org should make some time to talk about it, to make space to acknowledge the impact or the importance of voting. So far, we've got steady disagreements. And one of the biggest questions that comes up here is, but what is your org's mission? And does it feel like it's how directly does the org's mission seem to connect to policy, legislation, voting, et cetera, et cetera. So, I'm gonna stop. This is our last statement or the end of the activity. Let me stop the share. Tell me your thoughts on that statement. And I also am curious to know, which orgs are here today and how that might be part of the reasoning for your choice. So I'll leave it open to whoever wants to type or come off mic.
So I think like it goes into what I was like saying in the first question of like, I'm part of a religious organization. It's like if you want to talk politics, there are political organizations. Like I want, to this to be a safe space away from politics.
Mhm.
So it's like not everyone really wants to have that discussion 24/7 in every space they have because it gets complicated, it gets annoying, like it's a lot, so you need to take a break from it occasionally. So yeah, there are spaces, but every organization does not need to do that.
And thank you, Ken, to your point, particularly for your org's mission in the US, how much do we think about this idea of separation of church and state? And I heard you say it can get exhausting. And we are only in January. The elections themselves, by and large, are happening in November. So um, it would be easy to get exhausted, tired, bitter, or worse if you try to welcome or make space for official discussions of elections. As you probably know or may know, it won't, hopefully it won't shock you. TU has been recognized nationally for years around how active in the voting process we are. A voter engaged campus, the ways in which student leaders, student orgs, student athletes try to mobilize everyone, not who to vote for, but to think about that process, to do your own homework. There are a number of campus partners we've already begun to think about, given how international current events showed up on our campus in the fall. We're now thinking about what does it mean to prepare our campus for a heated election season where there will likely be strong viewpoints and differences of opinion. And my big question to you all as student leaders, what's your current answer on how should TU best prepare our campus for this whole thing called election season? And I would love honest answers. And maybe the answer is I'm not sure, but I think what I already heard is let's not focus all of our attention on it so early. We'll get burnt out. We'll get tired. We'll get exhausted. But I would love to get some thoughts, your brain power on thinking between now and November. What are the important things that our university should be mindful of or should be prepared for? And you can, again, use the chat or come off mic if you like. And does my even asking the question around elections bring up a certain viewpoint of like, yeah, too soon?
I just think that it might be too soon because it is in November, and I feel like if you just push the agenda of having like, oh, elections, elections, I feel like everyone would just get tired, and not everyone wants to hear about elections. They're just focused on school, trying to get at least a C or something. Like, I don't know. I think elections are just something that's should be like a little bit to the side, but like not pushed in your face kind of thing.
Laura, thank you for the honesty. I think I probably agree with you. I think well, I'm coming up on 8 years at TU. So fun fact, my on-campus interview for the first job I had here was 3 days after the 2016 election. That was the election of President Trump. And then I've been here during 2020. We were in COVID. We were mostly virtual, so it was a very different experience. This is sort of the first time back for an on-campus in-person experience. And I've worked in higher ed for decades, so I'm really curious to see how the campus responds. And to your point, Laura, I don't have any interest, no one does, in getting people bitter and exhausted before we even get to the fall. And I am curious, how can TU try to encourage folks to remember the importance of voting without, I don't know, exhausting people or getting them defensive? And there may not be a correct answer, but I'm always curious to know what you all as student leaders are thinking about. And so far, what I'm hearing is, yeah, too soon, not yet. Any other thoughts or suggestions? I do want to pivot. I'm curious, and you can certainly use the chat. We do have time if you would love to keep coming off mic. For those that were active in one or more orgs in the fall, let me ask it this way. How much, and you can do a one-word chat response, how much, if at all, did international events, the crisis in the Middle East, show up or impact your org's work in the fall? It could be none at all. It could be, maybe talked about, maybe there's more, but I'm curious if you're willing. Dolores says none. Thank you for that. And of course, it depends on the org's mission, but I'm given the number of scheduled events, exhibitions, demonstrations, protests, spontaneous arguments. So it's so far for the leaders here hasn't been much of an impact. I appreciate that. Okay. Let's get back into the slide. I want to make sure we get to a couple of sections. We will not get to every slide deck. I always try to be over prepared. I want to shift gears into the final sections, and then there'll be more opportunities for us to chat. So let's get back into the slides. We'll leave our friendly scale. Thank you all for offering your viewpoints. So when it comes to heated discussions, when it comes to incidents that feel like we need to get support, generally how we respond to possible incidents where a debate tension might lead to actual perceived harm. One of the things our teams in OIE do is try to really stress the importance of doing what you can, having a role in preserving the incident, knowing how to document it, and I'm always going to leave the time in the sessions to talk about reporting. You already saw my boss, Dr. Bradley. There was a slide on how to report it. You will see a version of it again today before we finish. Also know that asterisk for incidents that involve people living on campus, that's when there's a sort of a coordinated response from both HRL and the team in OIE. So for possible interactions that feel like a bias incident, it's important to keep in mind, have you done all you can to make sure that everyone involved feels safe? And that was language that we heard from VP Bradley. If you have the opportunity to be a supporter, a witness, or an involved party, the importance of pinpointing, if you have the opportunity to file a report, what were the actual facts? If you or someone you know is sharing that something happened, the importance as a community that really prioritizes belonging, to listen carefully, to just acknowledge that as discussions become heated, lots of feelings are involved. And also, what does it mean to support each other? Both for you as leaders in your orgs and just as students in general. If you have an opportunity, I know there's one session now happening in the time block, and the second time block. Our colleagues in student accountability are really doing really valuable trainings around what are some individual restorative practices, and they all fall under an umbrella of community and trust building and some commitments that orgs can consider adding to their tool belt. This next slide is a rehash of what we heard Dr. Bradley reference in terms of when there's a crime involved, the importance of getting rated TUPD. If you can pinpoint that there is a possible crime. Again, if not, we try to make it as easy as possible to report. You can do it virtually, you can do it through the phone, you can do it walk in person, you can go old school and use postal mail, but there are lots of ways. I'm going to get on a quick soapbox. I've been here long enough to have seen sometimes there are captured media of a possible incident and it gets posted and it goes viral. To be clear, this is me on my soapbox, tweeting at Towson U media that appears to be a possible incident, bias incident, or hate crime does not count as reporting it to the university. Unfortunately, we have the occasional sort of video clip image that gets posted on social media and goes viral. The big question is, has it actually been reported through these channels? So whatever you can do as leaders, spread the word. You can choose how you want to use social media to draw attention to a concern. Your call. Separately, if you're really trying to get support and resources to people who have been harmed, just know that this list are the ways that you can and should report it officially to our office. It would be really sad if individual footage of actual harm targeting our community was viral but never reported. So that's my invitation and my plea that you all help spread the word that there are formal channels to report, and posting, tweeting, yakking, TikToking, et cetera, does not actually count as reporting. Okay, off my soapbox. When it comes to online reporting, there's a current snapshot of the website, and I want to share an update that's coming, hopefully early this spring. Here's a screenshot when you currently go to the main website to try to find the links to report. You currently will see two options to report: whether the incident that you were involved in or you witnessed. The current distinction is whether it involves students or whether it involved employees. What's coming this spring is there going to be one unified link that doesn't matter, just report it and we will then tease it out. So for now, this is what you currently see. Just help spread the word that it'll still be this website. You'll just see a different link and it won't matter. So we don't want to create more pressure that you have to know you have to serve as somehow an investigator. So it'll be one unified link. Okay. Anyone involved in the T community should know and should feel responsible to report whenever they have knowledge or whether it's happened to them. My last reminder, filing a report of an incident does not mean that if you were involved, you are required to share. We hope you do. You'll get an invitation to share. You're not forced, mandated, or required to. We just hope that everyone who's willing will take the time to share with our team of investigators. We're going to shift from the incident reporting. I want to give you kind of a preview of a couple of sets of tools, particularly as student org leaders, that are helpful to navigate disagreements, tensions, whether they're about org matters or whether the occasional current event comes crashing into your org meeting. So I'm going to do a kind of a hodgepodge of pointing to a couple of things, but know that we won't get to every slide, and you're going to be able to get the link for all the slides in about 10 minutes. So first, this idea of comfort and safety is key. One of the first disclaimers when we started today tried to offer a distinction. I offer as a tool, the first tool in your growing tool bag, that there is some value in sitting with and working through your comfort. In fact, if all of us are willing to acknowledge that we all have our own comfort zone, and we're willing to occasionally tiptoe or lean ever so slightly into some discomfort, often that's where some new ideas, new perspectives, or new learning, or even some magic happens. Another tool I want to offer, particularly as folks who are leading orgs and have the opportunity to speak or facilitate or have the floor. Another way that you can add to your tool belt ways to get people to think about how they're going to show up and respond is a helpful framework that involves being mindful of how our responses are coming from our head and our heart. Ultimately, when you practice reflecting how much of our response is coming from up here, how much of it is the emotional, as you are more reflective and mindful of that, it often leads more insight into what's next. So an example of that, if the prompt is, think of a recent time in your org that you observed or you were directly involved in a heated discussion, debate, argument, or even if it felt like a fight, whether it was an in-person meeting or a social media or virtual meeting, think of the most recent time you can pinpoint. So put it in your head, I'm not asking for the details, but think of the most recent time there was that heated discussion or interaction. My question is, what happened? Now, if I narrow the question to what happened and give me the head response, typically I would ask for the statement of the thing, like the history of the facts. This person said this, the response was this, the meeting ended. That's sort of more of a traditional head response. If I asked what happened, but give me the heart response, the answer might be there was silence, there was anger, there was defensive, there was an attempt to shift to laughter, there was nervousness, there was an eye roll, there was shade thrown. The emotional heart response. So the tool is to occasionally think about how much of my response that I'm putting out there is coming from up here, how much is coming from here, and sometimes you can't tell. It could be both. So another tool is to be mindful of, especially if you have the chance to convene or moderate or facilitate, being intentional with your questions and maybe even practice. It can serve as an occasional break, especially when things are feeling tense, to step outside of that and think about that. Another tool, I'm going to go quick through a couple, and then I've got one section I want to make sure we get some time on. This idea of civility is really key. Whether it's current events, whether it's international or domestic elections, just be mindful. And I share this more so you have this slide for when the event is over and you can access the slides. This idea of civility involves thinking about, let me go back 1 minute. Oops, there we go. Civility involves talking about in your orgs a commitment to things like respect. It involves acknowledging and reminding members. Not usually, not everyone will have the exact same view. And when you say things about respect and politeness, I'm going to get to, before we're done, this idea of what is the group's set of commitments or norms. And I strongly encourage you as org leaders to have an intentional plan for how you want to manage your meetings in terms of a commitment to your values, not just TU's, but your org's values. So being mindful of a commitment to this idea of civility in the ways that you and your org wants to define it. Another tool is how you engage. I think we still hear a little bit about this idea of cancel culture. And we also, I really want to encourage you to, in your orgs, to have that commitment to avoiding this idea of blaming or shaming or calling out anyone, but rather calling in, inviting into to more honesty with respect. So that's another sort of tool that might ring true for some of you more than others. The next section, I want to do a quick preview. In my role at TU, I also help to oversee a program called Dialogue at TU. It's a series of skills, especially for when there's a strong difference of opinion. So I offer two graphics I'm going to do a quick run through. There are different types of interactions between people. There are different types of interactions that two or more people can have. This first graphic, I'm going to rip apart and go piece by piece. So I'm going to go from the bottom up. When you're framing an interaction as a debate, the goal in a debate is to win. The goal in a debate is to prove that your view is the correct view and the best view. And you do that with evidence, with persuasion. Sometimes you do it by demeaning the other person and their views. And in this graphic, that's meant to be two different people. It looks like the same person. So two people getting into it. They're arguing into the center. So the goal of the debate is to win your argument. And to be clear, I'm not offering a value judgment of good or bad. It's depending on your goal, what is the appropriate method to interact. And fun fact, if you don't know, TU has a strong history of an award-winning debate team. So debate might be your choice given your goals. I'm not going to spend too much time mentioning. We are about to, in the US, enter this horrific season of debate after debate after debate from candidates for local, state, and national office. Whether you choose to spend time or energy consuming them is up to you. That's the first method of interaction. Next up in the chart, discussion. The goal in the discussion is to make sure everyone's had a turn. So picture a group or a classroom where you have one person in charge with a prompt or a question, and if whether you're in a circle or not, you pass the mic. So I'm spinning around intentionally. Everyone gets the turn to respond to the same prompt. Could be your goal given, could be your best method given your goal. This idea of dialogue is a little bit different. You would choose a dialogue approach when your goal is to just give people a chance to be heard, when your goal is to encourage each of us to spend time learning other people's stories or experiences or perspectives. It's more organic. It doesn't need to go passing of the mic in a circle or in a row. It does involve more of the popcorn organic approach. So that's sort of the quick and dirty pyramid that has three different modes of interaction. I want to do one more graphic, and then I'm going to begin to land the plane for today. The other graphic takes these and it adds one more. So it frames four different types of interaction in this 2x2 matrix. So I'm going to start in the lower right. Debate, similar. The goal in the debate is to have the strongest argument, to convince everybody that your view is the right view. And it's in that quadrant because it is back and forth or two-way, and it is competitive. The goal is to win. Next up, we're going to wrap around clockwise. When you see diatribe, think of one person at the mic, one person in power, the leader, the president of an org, the president of a nation. If you are familiar with or remember the occasional January president of the US's State of the Union, our university president historically will do a once a semester speech or update to the campus. It is one way because one person has power and has the mic, and it is competitive because they're the leader. They have more actual perceived power over the rest of us. Let's finish the clockwise tour. When you see discourse, think of discussion in the other graphic. Discourse, when it says one way, that means, remember how I spun around? Discourse or discussion is one person is still deciding what the prompt of the question is. It's cooperative because you want to make sure everyone has a say, everyone has a vote, everyone has a chance to respond to the prompt. And finally, here comes dialogue, where it is two-way and it's cooperative. In all of the other three, the goal is to get to a finite endpoint, whether it's in a debate, who won, in a diatribe, every information the person in power had was shared. In discussion, everyone's always had a turn at every prompt. In a dialogue, the goal is often to leave with unanswered questions because the priority is spend time understanding other people's perspectives and other people's stories. So that graphic I add into your growing tool bag. If a group commits to practicing that dialogue skill, it improves group dynamics such that they learn new and different ways to learn about each other, to learn how to challenge each other in more authentic ways with more protections. Ultimately, it improves group functioning and group dynamics when it comes to their shared missions and values. I'm going to whip through the last couple of slides. This explains how the goals shift from those three. When you see discussion, you can replace it with leading an org or leading org meetings and walk through the columns and how they compare. There's no value judgment which one is best. It comes back to given your goal in the moment, which type is the best. How do we put it all into practice? I've mentioned that one of the ways I want to stress your growing tool bag is to consider a shared commitment as an org on how you run your org, run each meeting, and what are the goals that everyone has responsibility for. I mentioned in one of the earlier slides that defining how we unpack bias. this idea of intended impact. It's the last thing I'll sort of stress, and then we'll take final takeaways and questions. I've got two things to reflect on when it comes to understanding intended impact. The first is this one panel cartoon. The assumption is the person on the right drove over the person on the left's foot with their car. The statement is the key thing. The person who had the car says, "I didn't mean to run over your foot. I'm a good driver," as if to imply they're not responsible for causing pain or harm. So the absurdity of that cartoon is, if you're so narrowly focused on, but my intent was positive, it ignores the impact that we have on each other. A more provocative unpacking of intended impact, it's this 4-panel cartoon. So 3 people are involved. Blue and pink are walking and talking. Green is minding their own business. And inadvertently, pink keeps talking and is so focused that pink doesn't realize that they have walked over green's foot. Clearly, there's impact and harm and actual pain. And you can see that green is uncomfortable and hurting. Next up, pink is offended. Pink says, "Knock that off," as if green yelling has inconvenienced pink. Pink continues, "It is very unfair of you to yell like that when I didn't intend to step on your foot." Green says, "But you did." And by the way, they still are. So then it wraps up with Green saying, "And you're still on my damn foot." Pink's response is, "Yes, but it wasn't my intent. It wasn't on purpose." Here's how it wraps up. Pink says, "If you want me on your side, you should try being a little more considerate of my feelings." Pink wraps it up saying, "Yelling like that is how you turn allies into enemies." So it really points out this narrow view from Pink's perspective. And if it feels like Pink is trying to become the victim, that's part of the point to the cartoon. So it really gives you another way to wrestle with, after we're done today, the value of remembering the importance of intended impact, especially when there's disagreements, debates, fights, or even harm happening in your org. So this is a sample list of commitments. I've mentioned the importance of that shared values and a shared plan for your meetings. This is a sample. I encourage you to imagine crafting the list together as an e-board or as an org that you decide. I'm just going to show you the other slides you're going to get, and I want to make sure you have like a minute or two, and I know we're running over. You're going to have slides on how do the ways you ask a question help, especially if you're trying to practice certain approaches, whether it's discussion or dialogue. It's a chart with how do you ask the better open-ended questions. Then you're going to see additional resources. That's a shameless plug for me and my department. We are available to come back and have more discussions. If and when you're interested in wrestling with public displays of demonstration or activism, please know there's a newer resource since 2019 at the TU. That image is from a 2019 event that was on Cross Campus Drive. That will never happen again because TAT, the Tiger Advocacy Advisory Team, was formed to help respond to public demonstrations. We want people who are interested in doing activism to do it safely. And then ultimately, there's a new resource to know from the TAT website. It is a committee across the university. That is it. I'm going to get to the last slide. So as you're beginning to wrap up, if you're interested, this QR code will get you the slides I just used. You'll have instant access to them. I'm going to stop sharing, but still show you the QR code. Whoops. The recording will be available. You can use the QR code. I want to thank you for your time and attention. Welcome back to the semester. I will stick around if there's any last questions or if you want to connect, but ultimately I want you to enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you, everybody.